Hey, I think it's about time to begin. Is it ready? Okay. We're live. Welcome if you're watching our Bible class for the Elmore Church of Christ online. We're thankful that you're here, all of you who are here. Good morning. Got to tell you something funny about our trip. You know, my wife got stopped twice by the airport people, was patted down twice. In public, in front of everybody. I don't know what it is, but she's been hiding it from me for many, many years. So I just want to let everybody know that it's becoming a problem when we take trips. So yeah. Yeah. Anyway, we had a good time. We got to see our kids in Idaho on the morning. I guess yesterday morning when we came back, got on the plane, it had slightly snowed early that morning, so we did get a little snow while we were there. Not much, though. But it was cold. It was cold. So glad to be back here. We're going to be in Mark. Well, actually, we're going to be looking at Mark chapter 6 through 8. I know it's a lot of ground to cover, but remember, in this course or my purpose in the Bible class is not verse by verse or episode by episode. What I'm trying to do is show you the organization of Mark's gospel, which leads ultimately to the particulars of each thing and how they are positioned by Mark to show Jesus in a revolutionary way from the typical thought that the Jews and the Romans would have concerning someone of great power. And so Mark is redefining or reorienting people in how they perceive who and what Jesus is and what he's teaching. And so it's been fascinating to me to kind of take an aerial view of Mark and note the structure of it, which is I'm trying to present to you. The structure is very intentional. It's really tight. And what I mean by that, one of the ways in which when I was in school, taking my Bible courses and preaching courses and things of that nature, the best courses that taught me more were the courses that required me to outline a certain book. And the outline that I had to do was to follow the flow of the argument. Okay, like if you had Philippians, to outline the book, not just list the different events, but try to chart the structure as to how Paul is making his argument, what his purpose and point is, how does he get there, and that taught me a lot about how to read the Bible, because we're not really accustomed to doing that. Usually we take maybe a Bible book that we're studying on Sunday morning Bible class. We'll have a little introduction about who are the recipients and things of that nature, and all of that is very important. But I don't think that we have emphasized very much the structure of each book and the flow of these Gospels and the epistles and things of that nature. And that's captivated me for many, many years. So I know this is kind of out of the norm maybe of how a regular class in the Gospel of Mark you might have had, but I hope that you're gaining some insight into Mark in regard to the overall structure of the book. Now, this is the longest one. This section covers a lot of ground, and then we'll get into next week the midpoint of Mark. And so I'm covering a lot, but we'll read sections to illustrate what's happening in this particular section of the Gospel of Mark. So when we have Mark 1 to Mark 3, Jesus is very active, very powerful, and he's basically affirming everything that everybody wants to see in someone who is an anointed one, the Messiah, a very powerful individual. So we come to chapter 4. And there's a pause in which we have several collected parables that Mark has brought together to illustrate why the different responses to this powerful Messiah? Some people accept, some people contemplate, some people reject, and the parables kind of indicate what's happening. And so we had the parable of the sower, which represents, various reactions to the teachings and ministry of Jesus. Then we had these kingdom parables that are illustrating that things are happening, even though we find a lot of people rejecting what Jesus is doing and saying. That all the kingdom needs is a seed. And when the seed is sown, various things begin to happen. And it's mysterious. A farmer goes out and plants, he goes to sleep, and then you find the little thing that begins to, poke through the soil. And how does it happen? Who knows? God makes it happen. And then from that tiny little seed grows a, pretty good-sized garden plant that even birds can find nesting in it. And so those things are illustrating reactions, but even though we have a variety of reactions, it doesn't take everybody, to be positive or react positive to Jesus for something very profound to happen. And people are responding all the time. So it's almost the thing that I learned, I guess later in my preaching life. It was always kind of a despondency a preacher would have when no one would respond to the invitation. It's kind of like a test of a success or failure of your work. Until I began to realize, and it was taught to me, that that's not the governing success or rejection of any preacher's work is the number who respond to an invitation. Everybody's responding to it, just like they did to Jesus and Mark. Some respond positively, some are distracted. All things happen all the time in that particular way. So, when the seed is received and finds a good and honest heart, it can begin to germinate and create fruit that can be unimaginable as to the potential that the seed will produce. So after we pause to contemplate all the responses to this powerful Messiah, we sort of have a build-up in chapter 5. There's several things that happen where it's noted Jesus encounters the man who has the demonic possession, and is identified as Legion. And Jesus shows his great power over that. And we have other things that are elevating, that continue this trajectory of this Messiah who has great power, and it comes like to a crescendo. In chapter 6, it begins to go down. There are reactions, but Mark kind of shifts in his focus to the reactions of the people, and things are beginning to be stated by Mark, sort of like an editorial comment. There's the record of an episode, and then there's a summary of what happened and how people thought, and it's interesting to look at those, whether you call them editorial marks or Mark's comments or a summary of activity. Those things represent the theology of Mark. He's telling you that you have this event, and he gives a summary. That's highlighting what Mark seems to be emphasizing in his gospel. So, when we begin to go to chapter 6, and I want to read the first one, it kind of sets up. Look at your outline sheet. If you follow and you read, there is what we call a chiastic structure, and that is a technique, mainly a Jewish technique actually, where you have a progression of movement. Okay, like let's do it like A, and then it leads to B, and then a C, and then there's a reversal. You got a B, we call it B prime, and then he concludes with an A prime. And there's parallel, and we know it's a chiastic. Chiastics are sort of like an X. Take one part of the X, and it goes like this. This is a way that we find a lot of this in the Old Testament and all that. It's a way of bringing emphasis to a text. And this section is a perfect example of what's happening. And you'll see the parallels. Now, probably if we're reading verse by verse and stuff like that, we won't notice it. But if you take an aerial view, it becomes very obvious of certain things that Mark is doing in his presentation of Jesus. So we start out, and I want to just look at the outline here, and then we'll go to particulars and focus in on certain things. Jesus is rejected in his hometown. See, we've got all this powerful Jesus and all the rejections, but who would have thought he'd be rejected in his own hometown? You know, people who knew him, all of this. Well, that happens. And there's a statement that begins to emerge, this amazement statement. People are amazed at Jesus, okay, at what he does, but the people who should be impressed and drawn to him, those who would know him, are not amazed. It's, you know, the religious leaders are not amazed. The disciples, in a sense, are kind of like they never get it. There's a silence about them. The people who are amazed are not the people that you would think that would be amazed at what Jesus is doing. And so when we start in chapter 6, there's a statement that Jesus is amazed. There's a switch that Jesus is amazed at what? The unbelief of the people. Okay? So Jesus is rejected in his hometown. There's a statement, he is amazed at their unbelief. Then we go to another episode. Jesus feeds about 5,000 men. And in this, in Mark, in this story, in the conclusion, there's no comment about it. I mean, you would think after the feeding of 5,000 people that people would be very amazed, right? But the whole setup, Jesus says he's amazed at the unbelief. And here comes the feeding of the 5,000, and there's no amazement recorded. And that seems to be intentional by Mark because of what comes later. No amazement is noted. Jesus walks on water and intends to pass by the disciples. And the conclusion of Mark is their hearts are hardened. When you get to the Jesus walks on water, there's two episodes that record the failure of who you would think that would get it, the disciples and those closest to him. And then there's two episodes that parallel, that illustrate the outsider and the foreigner gets it. Okay? So, and that's what I have here. If you'll notice, you have Jesus walks on the water and tends to pass by who? The disciples. The disciples' hearts are hardened. Jesus encounters opposition from religious leaders. Many have evil hearts is the summary. Okay, so you have his disciples and you have the religious leaders of the Jews, and what's their attitude? It's not positive. It's hardness of heart. It's lackluster. Even though Jesus feeds 5,000 people, and he's notably an individual that can handle himself in a debate and a discussion, and is highly intelligent, theologically deep, you know, but there's no impact. And then, encountering those two episodes, we have Jesus is impressed with the faith of a Syrophoenician. You know, a demon is driven out from a distance, Jesus does, and there is this person is complimented of having great faith in Christ. Now, this person is an outsider. He's not a part of the in crowd. He's outsider. And then, secondly, the second episode, Jesus heals a deaf mute in Decapolis, and then a statement is made, he does all things well. Okay? So, you have two negative episodes, and then you have two positive. The two negative come from the ones who should be closest to him. And the two negative are those who are more distant from him. You see? So, then what's interesting, you remember the feeding of the 5,000? The next event is the feeding of the 4,000. Okay, we've come here to two negative examples, two positive examples, and then he backs out in that chiastic structure, and the 5,000 is balanced with the feeding of the 4,000. What happens there? No amazement is noted. There's nothing there. No one's impressed. No one learns from it. And then he ends this structure. Jesus is rejected again by the religious leaders, who counters or balances the rejection from his hometown. And the disciples, the statement, their eyes are dim and their hearts are dull. So he goes through the structure, okay? He's rejected by his people of his hometown. He feeds the 5,000. Then we have two negative examples of the people who are closest to him, his family and the religious leaders. They ought to know they're Jews. And then we have two outsiders. And then the feeding of the 4,000. And then he's rejected by his own people. So when you look from an aerial view, that outline, that's fascinating. It's real tight. It's balanced out. If you're just reading, you just really don't notice that. You go from one event to another. So there's something in the structure of Mark that is contributing to his presentation of Jesus. So Mark chapter 1 to 3, Jesus is powerful. There's a pause in chapter 4 of parables of the nature of the kingdom and why people are rejecting and accepting. We have right after that, chapter 5, that has a major thing of Jesus showing his power over the legion. Then you come to chapter 6, and things begin to decline pretty rapidly among his people. So, do you find that kind of interesting? Now, what I would challenge you to do is not take my word on it, but read it. Read this section, chapter 6, through chapter 8, verse 21, okay? Because it's a tight-knit structural section. Now, why ending at 8:11 through verse 21? Well, the reason is because Mark chapter 22, Mark chapter 8, verse 22, and Mark chapter 10, verse 46 are sort of bookends on the midsection of Mark. There are two sight miracles that I've indicated several times. We're going to be getting into those next week. But the sight miracle, the first one, is a reference to the dimness and the dullness of his apostles. Okay? And that's the sight miracle that's done in two stages. The person is healed. And Jesus says, "What do you see?" "I see men as if they're trees walking about." Well, what does that mean? It's kind of out of focus. Okay? Now, things are not clear. And then you go to the next sight miracle that comes several chapters later, sort of balance this, and we have this individual who wants to see, okay, and he receives sight, and he sees everything clearly. And after that, it is what we might refer to as the passion of Jesus, the quickness of the movement to the cross, okay? That's Mark's ultimate aim, is to redefine this great power in the shadow of the cross. When everybody thinks, if you're great and powerful, that doesn't end in such a humiliating death. I mean, the pharaohs built these big, monuments to themselves. The pyramids are lasting burial things of what we would think of the pharaohs who thought themselves, to become gods. Roman emperors, began to imagine themselves as being divine. We had the imperial cult that ultimately started to require the worship of the emperors of Rome. And so, in light of, the power and the exaltation of great leaders, okay, and Jesus is being paralleled as this great leader. In fact, a greater leader than the Caesars, a greater leader than anyone, a divine leader who's executed. You see the point. I mean, we understand that, but this is a controversial idea in the first century. It doesn't make sense to anyone's imagination for a supreme divine leader who has so much power to submit himself and be executed by the hands of puny human beings on a cross that is considered to be a very shameful, even from the standpoint of the Jews and from the standpoint of the Romans. The cross represented a shameful death for people who were thieves and thugs and all of that. It's kind of strange, isn't it? But see, that's what Mark is doing. He's building up. Everybody's, yeah, this is the Jesus I'm looking for. Why isn't everybody following him? Well, not everybody does. He even shows himself over the legion. And now we come to this section, Mark chapter 6 through chapter 8, where he begins to accentuate that people are very slow to come to an understanding of who and what Jesus is and what he's come to do. So let me pause right there. Are there any comments that you have or questions? All right, let's go to Mark 6, beginning in verse 1. This comes after Jesus has had several miracles of healings. Jesus went out from there and came into his hometown, and his disciples followed him. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogues, and many listeners were astonished, saying, "Where did this man get these things? And what is this wisdom given to him? And such miracles these performed by his hands." Everybody's recognizing him as having what? I mean, what's the confession? This is openly. There's, Mark's recording the thoughts. It's kind of like Mark's a reporter. He's going around, okay, what are you saying about it? I don't understand where he's getting all this wisdom, and I don't understand how he's able to perform miracles. And these are people in his hometown that know him. Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James, and Joseph, and Judas, and Simon? Are not his sisters here with us? And they took what at him? Okay, so do they admit that he has great wisdom? Yes. Do they affirm that he's performed some miracles? Yes. Why do they take offense at him? Yeah, he's got above his raisin. Yeah, he's It's that hometown mentality. Yeah. Yeah. It's not like Jesus was maybe some of us were in our hometown. The reason I would have trouble in my hometown of being known as a preacher is because they knew me when I wasn't. And that wasn't good. Okay, that's not an exact parallel with Jesus, okay? Okay, what are you laughing for? This is my wife that made that cackle noise, I just want everybody to know. So we have Jesus who is there with the people, and they've seen him grow up and all this. There's been certain episodes about him. You remember when he was 12 years old, and I'm sure talk of him being among the teachers and having discussions with them and all that. It wasn't just a private thing. I'm sure there's some talk about this guy who's, he's sort of is intriguing. But so he comes to his hometown, and there's probably a lot of that, that, why is it him? It doesn't fit what? It doesn't fit the expectations, I wouldn't think. It doesn't fit their, how they construed someone of very prominence and importance coming up, and God raising up. So they take offense at him. When you take offense at somebody, what does that mean? Or maybe he's making himself out to be better than they are. A lot of people take offense like that. Yeah, carpenter's son, yeah. Yeah, okay. It, it has to be. Yeah, the focus isn't upon Joseph, it's upon Jesus. To emphasize, the thing is, he mentions all the brothers. I don't know. The focus is on the carpenter's son. Now, you're what's the name of your, Dallas is just what's the name of your company? How would you describe it? What you do? Yeah, Dallas is just a slave of the, the hydro whatever water thing that Marshall does. Yeah, water services group. Dallas is just the son of the the water services group. Well, I think that the way that it's stated is to show from the standpoint of those who are around somewhat of the opinion or the judgment they have made about who Jesus is.
Many commentators believe that probably by this point
Joseph's dead, yeah.
And likely several years old and married by the time they got married.
Yeah. Joseph is like several people in the Bible that serve as a name and then he's gone. It's like if you read Ruth, you have, what's his name? What? No. Elihu. No, that's not Elkanah, the husband. Okay, Elkanah is introduced and he has a role, but then he's gone. It's just about Ruth and the others, and Joseph, I think, is somewhat like that. Not that he's not important in everything, but the story does not center around Joseph. Does that make sense? I mean, Jesus' father. Are you with me? Yeah. You're the one that brought it up. I don't understand why you're not following the train of thought here. So, let's continue reading Mark chapter 6. So, all the things performed by his hands, is this not the carpenter's son, the son of Mary, and brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon, are not his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. Jesus said, a prophet is not without honor except in his own hometown and among his own relatives and in his own household. And he could do, and this is what's interesting, he could do no miracle there except that he laid his hands on a few people and healed them. And he wondered at their unbelief. And he was going around the villages teaching. I find this a very interesting episode here, particularly the statement, he could do no miracle there. He did some, but what does that mean he could do? What in other narratives, when they found out that Jesus was who he claimed, they had these thoughts about him, who did he usually have around him? The crowd. Why were they there? Yeah, they would bring the sick and all that, but notice in his hometown, there's the absence of what? The crowd, the faith. No one's coming. He just, and I like how Mark says, well, he just put his hands on a few sick people and all that. And think of that contrast to previously when what? You had the woman who had the issue of blood. You had the crowd, all these people who have come. But here it's like he comes to his hometown and says, They take offense and they've seen and they acknowledged everything about him, but no one is interested. No one is drawn to him. No one's asking questions. All they're doing is making accusations. Who is this guy? Go ahead. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Well, John, I think it's John chapter 7, indicates that his family, his brothers, didn't believe in him. They didn't have they hadn't grown yet. Go ahead.
Getting into speculation a little bit, but if Joseph had passed away a few years prior, that would have taken away a major influence.
Yeah.
On his son, on his
Why didn't Jesus keep him alive?
and Mary wants to keep harmony within the family. So she knows the truth, but she can't by herself persuade the brothers and the sisters to come to the same knowledge that she does. So she just has to keep the family together, and she's wanting to reach out to Jesus, but she feels like she can't.
I think a parallel might be, in light of that, is, Joseph. Think about Joseph, how his family turned on him when the dad doted over him. So John, I think it's John 7, indicates that his brothers were not believing in him. And since there's nothing that's said positive about them, except they're there, and I'm assuming that since they're there, they're included with the others. Because there's nothing that is in the episode that's making them different than the others. And I think that's intentional by Mark. It's all intentional. Because we have all kinds of questions. But the question, I think, that is prominent is, why is Mark doing what he's doing? Why does he leave out what others include, or include what others leave out? It has to be for a theological purpose in making his point. So Jesus, it ends, he wondered at their unbelief. Who's the there? Who's the antecedent of their unbelief? Well, usually when you have a pronoun like that, there, who the there are, you go back until you find the first noun, perhaps, that it refers to. And the first thing, you come to has to do with his family, the people that are part of his community. He wonders. To wonder, that's a strong term. He is, and this coming from Jesus himself, Son of God, he is just taken aback at the disbelief of his own kin and relatives and friends, people that would know him. He wondered at their unbelief. Now, to accentuate that, we come to even this has to be outside of the cross and the resurrection. The most profound miracle Jesus performed is the next episode. Why would I say that? All Gospels, all four of them, have it. Now, in other words, not all the Gospels share the same things, even though there's a lot that's common. But every one of them have the feeding of the 5,000. That must have been a profound event back in the first century. Just think about it. It's a roundabout figure of just the males. About 5,000 people, men. But then if you considered, the females and perhaps children and things like that. It could have been a very massive crowd. About 5,000 people fed. So let's look at this. Chapter 6, beginning in verse 30. Now, I left out some things that we've already covered to show you structure on how Mark teaches. And, the sandwiching, where we have an outer narrative and an inner narrative. We already looked at John the Baptist's fate. And it's interesting that John the Baptist's fate comes after Jesus' bewilderment over the the attitudes of those who should, I would think, come to him, be attracted, ask more questions. What's going on? But we come to the feeding of the 5,000. The people saw them gathering, and many recognized them, and ran there together on foot from all the cities, and got there ahead of them. When Jesus went ashore, he saw a large crowd, and he felt compassion for them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And began to teach them many things. When it was already quite late, his disciples came to him and said, "This place is desolate, and it is already quite late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." And then you have verse 37, but he answered them and said, "You give them something to eat." I find this kind of a great teacher does these kinds of things to someone he's mentoring. Because there's a point in which you try to nudge the little bird out of the nest. Mommy, I want my worm. Well, why don't you go get it this time? and the bird gets kicked out of the nest, and they got to go find their own food or whatever. That's what good teachers and mentors do. Is over the period of time, you're trying to teach, and then you want them to put in practice what they've learned and the application of it. So Jesus, supposedly, from the standpoint of the disciples who are around him, they have some idea of who he is. They've confessed it. They've said these things. They've seen the miracles. They've been there. They've been privy to a lot of things that we would just want to be a fly on the wall to see. And so Jesus turns around, I would be the same way. What do you mean? I don't have anything. And Jesus says then, well, what do you have? So let's continue reading. They said to him, shall we go and spend 200 denarii on bread and give them something to eat? And he said to them, how many loaves do you have? Go look. Do you have that in your Bible? Yeah, I'm the go look. Go and see. Go look. It's an imperative. Go look. Why do I have to tell you everything? Go look. It's kind of like they're asking for guidance, and they should be at the point now to where there's some expectation Jesus has of them. So he says, go look. And when they found out that, they said, 5 and 2 fish. And he commanded them all to sit down by groups on the green grass. They sat down, groups of hundreds and fifties. And he took the 5 loaves and 2 fish. And looking up toward heaven, he blessed the food and broke the loaves. And he kept giving them into the disciples to set them before them, and divided up 2 fish. And among them all, they all ate and were satisfied. And they picked up 12 full baskets of the broken pieces, and also all the fish. There were 5,000 men who ate the loaves. Now, I don't know what that must have been like for Jesus to pray over this, and they keep coming back, and they feed all of it. That's a lot of people, isn't it? Have you been to an arena of holding 5,000 or more people? Yeah, not lately. But, that's a lot of people. And so he feeds them. And then there's no editorial remark. This is a profound thing, and Mark says nothing about it. There's no comment. Which You'll understand why there's not, because he makes a reference to it later when he talks to the disciples, and he rebukes them for their unbelief. Now, here's another one that's interesting. Jesus walking on water. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him on the other side to Bethsaida, while he himself was standing, sending the crowd away. After bidding them farewell, he left the mountain to pray. He left to the mountain to pray. When it was evening, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Seeing them straining at the oars, for the wind was great against them, at about the fourth watch of the night he came to them, walking on the sea, and intended to pass by them. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed that it was a ghost, and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately, there's that theme in Mark, immediately. But immediately he spoke with them and said to them, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped, and they were utterly astonished, for they had not what? They had not, what does the text say? They had not understood or gained any insight from the incident of the what? Of the loaves, the 5,000. But their heart was hardened. How could that be? What's Jesus saying about them? Now, I tell you, this is interesting when you think about the parallels with the Old Testament. And I ran across this one time. I don't know. It's just interesting to see, because Jesus is showing himself to be God incarnate. You remember when God passed before Moses? He was going to give Moses an opportunity to see his back, and it was God was going to pass by him, to show his glory to Moses. You remember that episode? Well, some have indicated that Mark might be making a hint to the same kind of thing for the disciples. This is an opportunity for them to see the glory of God. Jesus was not going to stop. He was going to pass by them to the shore and wait on them. But they cried out and they were afraid. They didn't recognize Jesus as the glorious, divine one walking on water. I mean, it almost seems to think that Jesus expected them to understand, well, there he goes. Here he is walking on water. We'll see you on the other shore when we get there. Jesus passes by. He was going to pass by them. He saw that they were struggling, but he was going to pass by them. That idea of passing by his disciples, some have suggested that it sort of parallels Moses having the opportunity to somewhat see in a limited edition the glory of God. But they would not recognize Jesus' glory because they hadn't arrived at a faith yet that he wants them to have. Instead, he rebukes them. He rebukes them. Now, from a larger perspective, the disciples in the Gospel of Mark are not put in a good light at all. At all. And so, the statement that Mark says is their hearts are hardened. If you have a hardened heart, what's the problem? What is it? You're not right. You're do what? Okay. Closed. Yeah. It's not open. In the book of Hebrews, the hardness of heart is sort of like the opposite of faith. Beware of the hardness of your heart. It's closed. So whatever preconceived ideas or all the events that have happened, their heart is still not opened to what's really happening before them. Now, what's amazing, though, we probably wouldn't react any different. Mark is sort of, I think, the reader has to ask the question, when you're reading this from the disciples, would I be any different? We would hope that we would, but they had all the advantages. They were there in the inner circle with the feeding of the 5,000. Well, if that didn't convince them that Jesus is God incarnate, what else will? Walking on water? No. So, their hearts are evil. Then in chapter 7, I'm almost, time's up, I'll have to go. This is too good to not finish. So, let me leave it there because our time is up. And we'll come back to it next Sunday. And it might be good if you could read this section, perhaps with this outline, and sort of see the structure of it could be helpful. All right.